This week's topic is social variation in language. We'll start with this general introduction to the topic, which will then be followed by a lecture on Standard English and one on Aboriginal English. Every language in the world is spoken slightly differently by different groups of people. For example, people who live in one part of a country may speak slightly differently from people in another part of the same country. Such different varieties of a language that are linked to particular geographical locations are called dialects. Some language varieties are associated not so much with different geographical areas as with different socio-economic groups. For example, in many countries, people who are considered working class speak somewhat differently from people who are considered middle class. Such socio-economically determined varieties of a language are sometimes referred to as socialects. People also use language differently in different social settings. Different ways of speaking are associated with different levels of formality or respect. For example, the way you speak when you're talking to your friends in a bar is going to be different from how you speak when you go to ask your boss for a pay rise. Learning which variety of a language to use in which particular social situation is an important part of what it means to learn to speak a language. It's part of the knowledge that children internalize when they acquire their first language, and it's part of the competence that needs to be learned when learning to speak a second language. As an example, let's look at a common social variable in Australian English. A social variable is a way of using language which is different between different social groups. Some of the most important social differences that have an effect on language are age. Younger people often speak differently from older people. Gender. Women often speak slightly differently from men. And social status. People of different social classes often speak differently. In 1977, a researcher called Anna Schnuckel looked at how language was used by these different groups in Cessnock in the Hunter Valley. One of the variables she looked at was the use of the past tense versus the past participle of irregular verbs. Remember that an irregular verb in English is one where you can't form the past tense by adding the suffix ed. With verbs like play or walk, you can add ed and get the past tense forms played and walked. So they are regular verbs. But for verbs like eat or fly, you can't do this. Adding ed to those gives you eated and flied, which are not the correct past tense forms of these verbs. They are irregular verbs. They have past tense forms which cannot be predicted by a rule. In Standard English, there's a difference between the past tense form and the past participle form only with the irregular verbs. We say, I ate, but I have eaten. And we say, I flew, but I have flown. With regular verbs, on the other hand, the past tense and the past participle look exactly the same. I played, and I have played. He walked, and he has walked. Many non-standard varieties of English use the same form for the past tense and the past participle in irregular verbs as well. Often, it's the past participle form which also gets used for the past tense, as in, I seen him yesterday, or she come home drunk. In Standard English, these are forms of the verb that would need to come after the auxiliary have, as in, I have seen him, or she has come home. But in this non-standard variety, this form is being used as the past tense. Sometimes, it's the past tense form that gets used for the past participle, so following the auxiliary have, as in, I could have showed you, or he might have went to jail. When Anna Schnuckel looked at how these different forms were used in Cessnock, she found that there was no difference in how men and women used the non-standard forms. We can see that both men and women used the non-standard past tense, as in, I seen him, about equally often, 27.4% for men and 26.2% for women. For the non-standard past participle, as in he might have went, the numbers are lower for both men and women, but again, they're about the same. The differences in age aren't what we call statistically significant either, meaning that the differences aren't big enough that we can be sure it's not just coincidence. But if we look at the differences between middle class and working class, there's a huge difference. Basically, middle class people didn't use the non-standard varieties at all, whereas working class people used them quite a lot. We can see clearly that the different ways of using the past tense and the past participle are associated with differences in social class. But why does this type of difference arise? In modern Australia, everyone has access to pretty much the same education, at least at primary level, and everyone can hear the standard language spoken, for example, in the media. Everyone knows that using non-standard forms like I seen him or use is associated with a low level of education and a low socioeconomic class, and that they're considered by many people to be wrong or bad. So then, why do people keep using these forms? Language is much more than just an instrument of communication. We use language to say something about who we are, who we identify with, which groups we consider ourselves to belong to. And this is something that can change according to the situation. Imagine that you've grown up in a small rural community and then gone off to university in a large city and started speaking like they do there. If you then come home for a visit and you go out for a drink with your old friends, you may change the way you speak again to sound like your old friends do, rather than like people at university do. You do this because you want them to think of you in a certain way. You want them to see you as being one of them. If you were to speak in a different way, you would essentially be saying, I'm different from you now. This is one of the most important reasons for why different language varieties exist, because we use differences in language to construct and reflect our social identity. We all have many different social identities. In one setting, we may identify ourselves as university student, and in another setting as old friend from way back. We use language to signal these differences, and this is why people continue to use non-standard varieties, such as I seen her. It's not because they don't know that it's considered incorrect by many people. It's because they want to signal that they identify with a certain group of people who speak in a certain way. The language used does not passively reflect people's socioeconomic background. People don't speak in a certain way because they come from a certain background and so don't know any better. On the contrary, using certain language varieties is a tool that people actively use to show which background and which social groups they identify with. And this is something that can and does change in different situations.